get the sharing going. Everybody can see the slides. Okay, perfect. All right, so apologies for the technical challenges there, but I suppose with an online conference, even an in-person conference, unheard of. So yes, thanks everybody for coming out today. We're going to talk about how you can add a robust event system to your Drupal site in just minutes. And my name is Martin Anderson Klutz on Drupal.org and various platforms, including Twitter. I go by Mandclue, and I work for a company formerly known as Digital Echidna that now is known by the name of Northern. So for our talk today, we're actually going to do most of the spend most of our time in this demo environment that I set up, which really is a fresh install of Drupal 9. So I just reset it over lunchtime, and it's just to sort of verify for you all that this is a fresh install of Drupal. We're going to go up here to the add content and show that there's only the 2 default content types there. So from there, wanted to just say, it's basically if you wanted to spin up a really simple version of Drupal, you could do that in just 4 commands. This is closer to what I did because I wanted to install admin toolbar. I find that makes using Drupal a lot easier. Also the Gin admin theme and Gin toolbar, and then set those as the defaults and so on. So to sort of reproduce exactly what I'm working with, you'd be looking at something more like that. If you wanted to make it into a single sort of chain command so that you could just run it and then it's done, it would look more like that. So if you want to, try these steps at home later on, you can use that as a guide point. And I tried to mention earlier, but I think I might have been muted, that the slides will be posted the session later on. So you can use this as a guide if you want to reproduce what we're going to see. So really in terms of what we're going to do here, let's start actually getting something installed to create this event management system that we want. So let's go Composer, acquire Drupal Smart Date Calendar Kit. So you'll notice that this runs super fast, which is one of the many benefits of Composer 2. So if you haven't tried it yet, I definitely would encourage you to do that. And now let's get that module installed. So now we're going to enable Drush Smart Date Calendar Kit. It is going to enable a few modules and install some configuration. And now that that's done, we can go back here. And if we go back, let's refresh the page. And now if we go back up to our content menu, you can see that we have this event content type. But before we dig into that, let's dig into, or spell out, I guess, what we mean when we talk about a robust event management system. So we want to create an event content type that has an input with sort of app-like functionality, something that will feel familiar to your editors when they're using that within Drupal for the first time. We want to have the ability to have a checkbox for all-day events, because again, that lines up with popular calendar applications. The ability to manage recurring events, potentially with time zones, and then also to have more natural language output. And we'll dig into exactly what that means in a couple of slides. We want to have lists of both upcoming and past events, as well as an interactive calendar where you can sort of drag and drop to manage the different events that are upcoming and so on. And the bulk of what we're going to see is really based on this Smart Date module, which was only an idea a little over 2 years ago, and now is one of the 500 most popular modules on Drupal.org. But that idea really started off with this editor experience. I had been working on an events website and doing some, getting some data populated into it so that we could, troubleshoot views and do theming and so on. And I started to notice how tedious it was to input dates and times in the site that we were building. And I started thinking about, well, why is that so different from, using something like a Google Calendar? And I started to realize that part of it, or a big part of it, is because in this type of a configuration, you have to manually populate 14 different pieces of data. So for the start, you've got year, month, day, and then for the time, you've got hour, minute, seconds, and then AM or PM, and then, you know, another 7 pieces of data for the end. Whereas if you contrast that to popular calendar software, they do a couple of things that substantially reduces the amount of effort. So one of them is having this default that falls the next hour on the hour. And then the other bigger piece is really this concept of duration. So it defaults to an idea of a duration of 1 hour. And then as you adjust the start, it'll automatically adjust the end. And so those definitely aren't going to line up with 100% of the meetings that people are looking to schedule, but it fits a lot of very common use cases. And so there are probably a lot of times where you might go to create an event in your calendar and you only need to change 2 or 3 pieces of data to have, you know, your dates and times entirely set up, which again is a big difference from the 14 that you need with Core. The other thing that I'll point out is both of these have, again, that all-day checkbox, the ability to repeat events, and it's probably cut off on the Apple one, but I'm sure it has it. Also the ability to manage time zones. So let's come back to that discussion of natural language output. So this is out of the box what you tend to get with Drupal core date range field. So it basically fully spells out the information for both the start and the end, which is quite a difference from if you were to write the same range sort of by hand. You'd probably only write out the date once, and then it's pretty common when something falls on the hour to format that differently than it does, you know, at some other point within the hour. And usually you would also only show the time zone once. And I guess the context there is that was something that I was getting a lot of clients asking us to do, and it felt like it was sort of custom to implement every time. So definitely something that we wanted to make easier to implement. Also around the same time, I was getting a site ready to launch and doing a crawl looking for performance issues. And I was really surprised to see that the slowest page on the site was an events archive page that basically had no data in it, and there weren't that many events overall. So I opened up the query debugging in views and was surprised to see how much work the database was having to do on kind of a row by row level to convert data, you know, strings and so on into dates that could be used for the proper comparison. And so that's when I realized that there was actually a performance issue with storing dates as strings. And that's why I wanted to use something that would be more efficient. And so at that point, I decided that we really needed a module that could provide that better editor user experience, that could provide, you know, sort of more natural language formatting out of the box, and then also address those kinds of performance issues. So with all of that said, now let's go back into our demo environment here and look at the ability to create an event here. So let's just call this test event. And you can see that it already has some of the similarities. So it has that concept of duration, and we can switch the duration and it'll automatically update the end. We could update the beginning and it updates the end based on the duration and the beginning. We have our all day checkbox and so on. But let's go ahead and make a couple of other events here just so we can show some of the other features. Let's go 2021, 14. Let's make this an all day. Set it to be till the 18th. So if we save that, you can see that it's done some of those things that we've talked about already. So for a range that's within the same day, it only shows the date once. If it falls on the hour, it shows a more compact formatting. The date isn't quite as clean as we would like, but part of the challenge there is that when you have the day of the week as part of your date string, it becomes much more challenging to make that more compact. So let's go ahead and update our display configuration to a different format. So when we go down here, we've got a number of different formatters. We're just using the default Smart Date one, and Smart Date has its own formats. It comes with 4 out of the box. So let's go to this compact one. And when we save that and save our configuration, we can refresh our date. And you can see how much cleaner that is, April 15th to 18th. It will only output the the month and the year once, unless the date crosses over, and in which case it has the intelligence to be able to add additional pieces as they're actually necessary to accurately represent your event. All right. We talked about time zones as being one of our requirements, and actually SmartDate supports time zones out of the box, but because many sites don't actually need them, it's left as sort of an optional piece that you can add in by switching the widget. So if we switch our widget here, we can look at the configuration. We have the ability, by default, it'll only store a time zone if it's specified and different from, or it'll only store it if it's explicitly declared. You can do things like make sure that a time zone is always stored, whether or not it matches the site, but I find that this works pretty well. The other thing that you can also do, if you leave this empty, it'll just show all of the time zones on the edit experience, but it is possible to show your editors a subset of that list. So let's say you have a site where you only need to support US time zones. So we could say, let's show Anchorage. Let's show, let's see, Chicago. Show Denver and Los Angeles and New York. So if we save that now, let's go back over here and actually create a new event. And you can see now we have our time zone dropdown, but it's showing us just the options that we've sort of explicitly told it to make available. So for your editors, that can be a substantial time saving in terms of, not having to scroll through that whole giant list. So let's go ahead and call this time zone event. Actually backdate this one a couple of days and go ahead and save that. All right, so you can see now it's got our event. It's outputting it as the time that we declared it at, 2 to 3 p.m. This is in Mountain Time as we declared it. In brackets, it's putting the site time so that you can see both of those, which can also be kind of a cue for visitors in terms of knowing that it's a different time than the site default or using a different time zone. But it would be more useful if it had the actual time zone explicitly shown in there. And so what we need to do is update our SmartDate format to include that time zone. So let's go ahead and go into there. One of the things that you'll notice in here is that there are definitely similarities between the SmartDate formats and sort of the core date formats in the sense that they both use these PHP date codes, but the SmartDate formats are much more granular. So you've got separate ones for date and time, and then you can even have a separate one for times that fall in the hour. So let's go ahead and just add the versions that have the time zone. There are a variety of other configurations that you can do to really sort of customize that output to whatever your specific needs are. And even if that output duplication isn't working well for your particular use case, you can turn it off entirely, including that site time display. The other thing I'll point out is that all of this configuration is completely translatable. So you can have, very sort of culturally specific date formatting depending on, which languages and sort of countries you need to support. So now with that changed, let's go back into here. Let's refresh that. And now you can see it's showing our time zones in there. All right, next thing we should touch on is recurring events. So we mentioned that as one of the things that we want to have as part of our event system. It is something that's pretty commonly available, especially again in the application software that your editors are probably used to interacting with on a daily basis. And though there are some differences in terms of the interfaces that they tend to use for those, the functionality that they provide is generally pretty similar. So the ability to provide events that recur, on a certain interval. So like every 2 weeks, being able to repeat sort of daily, weekly, monthly, or annually. You can set specific days of the week on which it should recur. and then also to be able to have it end either on a specific date or after a certain number of occurrences. I'll mention in passing that some of these apps use this R rule specification as a way to define the sort of the rule on which that event is going to recur. If you want later on, like maybe in the questions, we could dive into that, but I'm not going to dig too far into that today. In terms of how SmartDate implements recurring dates, one of the key decisions was to have the instances of that recurring rule actually stored as normal field deltas for that SmartDate field. And that means that when you use it to display things, access the values through Twig, create views, any of those things, it behaves just like a normal field value. You don't have to do any kind of sort of extra site builder or anything to make those accessible and available. You do have the ability to override specific instances. So you could, reschedule one of them to a different day or cancel it altogether. And you also even have the ability to revert them back to the original, sort of time and date. Oop. There is also a, I'm going the wrong direction here. There is also a special formatter for recurring dates where you can really optimize the output, but we're actually going to see that in the demo, so I'm not going to dive too far into that here. I did also try and adopt this idea of starter kits, which are really modules that only provide configurations. So the idea being that if you wanted to use SmartDate or even use SmartDate with something like full calendar view, rather than having to sort of install each module individually and then configure them to work together, you can install one module like we've done in this session and get both modules pre-configured in this event management system. And so if you're wanting to try out SmartDate, it can be a really good way to see how it's meant to work. But you could also use it as the starting point in terms of, if your site has requirements for some of these elements, then you can install something like the SmartDate calendar kit and then continue to add fields and filters and basically mold it into exactly what your site needs it to be. I've tried to build in a lot of what I consider best practices in terms of providing a good administrative experience. But if you install it and have some different ideas, definitely would welcome, patches or feature requests and what have you. So in terms of the calendar integration, it's pretty feature rich in the sense that it has that drag and drop support. You can do things like a double click within the calendar to add different events. And because of the way SmartDate handles recurring dates as sort of normal field deltas, there's full support for all of your recurring dates out of the box. And you can sort of have any kind of mixture of recurring and non-recurring dates without having any kind of technical challenges. So with that, let's actually go back to the command line and run the last command that we need here, which is to enable the recurring submodule. So smart. All right, and then the last thing that we need to do now is to go back to our field and explicitly tell Drupal that we want this field to allow recurring dates. SmartDate doesn't assume that just because you can make dates recurring that you want to do that for every field where you've used it. So it's something that you have to explicitly tell it to use. There's this months to extend because you don't have to set an end to your date, but if you create a date without specifying any kind of an end, you wouldn't want Drupal to sort of like keep generating instances until it runs out of memory or blows up your database or both. So it uses this concept of kind of a time window, and it'll generate out to that and then use a cron job to make sure that you always have, in this example, 12 months of events moving out into the future. I'll also show while we're in here that here's where you can configure some of the other elements for SmartDate. So it provides this custom default value of next hour. You could also customize the duration values that were available. So let's just change something. We'll set a 0 duration as something that's allowable. So let's say you had a website launch that you wanted to put in your calendar. It's really more of a moment in time as opposed to something that has a start and an end. And let's just add another one in here. You can also change what the default duration is. And if we save that And now go over to here and create a new event. You can see now that we have our ability to set it as recurring. It's changed the default value, and now we have some of those other elements we can set as 0 duration if we want to. And all of those have changed. But let's play around with the recurring values. So you can say, every 3 months. You can also do things like say it should be every month on the, third Wednesday. In our case, I think what we'll do is just leave those for now. We'll make it weekly recurring, maybe every other week on Monday and Thursday. And let's say that should end after 10 times. Not forgetting to give that a title. Let's call that recurring event. And now you can see that it's generated all of those instances for us. It's showing us all of the values that it's created. It's not terrible when it's just 10, but you can imagine if you had an event that was recurring, let's say 2 times a week for the next 2 years, then that would get really unwieldy in terms of the amount of data to show. So let's take a look at using the Smart Date Recurring Formatter. So if we change it to that, in terms of the options that we have now, we can set a specific number of recent and upcoming instances that should actually be shown. So let's say maybe we only want to show the 1 most recent and the 3 next ones that are coming up. There's an optional HTML time wrapper, HTML5 time wrapper. We can show that if we update and save that. And now look at our recurring event again. You can see it gives us sort of this natural language output of our event happens every 2 weeks on Monday and Thursday at 2 for 10 times. Oh, I know why it's only showing upcoming is because it starts now, so there haven't been any recent. So let's go ahead and backdate this back to there. And now when we update it, we can see we have, it's showing the 1 most recent exactly the way we've configured it, and then the 3 next ones. The structure of all of this is in a Twig template. So when in your theme, if you said, I don't want to have these as collapsible details elements, I want them as nested divs, I want to reorder these in any way, you have all of the flexibility there. And then the last thing, since we mentioned it in the configuration, is let's take a look at the markup here and see that it's using the HTML5 time element, which can also help with your SEO in terms of being able to sort of parse out those micro formats. All right, I think the last thing then is to look at the calendar. So let's go up to our calendar. And you should be able to see all of the different events that we've created so far in this demo. So our recurring event is in there. The sort of single events that we've created are in there. We could do something like take this specific one and move it over a day. It asks for a confirmation. This is something you can turn off if you don't want it in the view configuration for full calendar view. Personally, I like to have it because I think with drag and drop, it'd be pretty easy for somebody to change something unintentionally and not realize it. So let's say that's okay. You can also, within the day, drag and drop to change when it happens. And you can even drag and drop to change the duration. And then the other thing that we mentioned was the ability to double click. You can see that it defaults to exactly the date and time of where we had clicked in the calendar. So let's just call that our calendar created event and save it. And now when it comes back, you can see our calendar created event is in there. The other thing that I'll mention is we talked about having the list views, and it gave us those out of the box as well. So we've got our upcoming events and our past events, and those are all connected in a nice little tab set there. So I feel like we've gone through and we've been able to deliver on all of those requirements that we talked about pretty easily. So we've got our app-like widget. We've got an all-day checkbox. There's timestamps under the hood. That one's a little harder to demonstrate in a presentation this short. In terms of the formatting, we've got that natural language output. And then for easy site building, we were able to install recurring dates, interactive calendars, and the ability to manage time zones. And we did it all in, I mean, really the time spent to do the installation was probably under a minute. We needed to run those 3 terminal commands and configure the date field to allow recurring events. And other than that, it was really just sort of customization, and that'll be up to you to match exactly what you need for your particular site. So with that, I am going to turn it over for any questions. Get the question tab. So I think it starts, yeah, I'll start at the bottom since those are the first questions here. So first question, curious about the edge cases with dates, events that pass through a time change, events that change time zones like an airplane flight, recurring events that land on leap days. So leap days, I guess the thing to understand about how Smart Date handles all of the recurring events is it uses a third-party PHP library called Recur with 3 R's, 2 at the end. And that, I believe, does all of the work of handling things that cross over sort of like daylight savings time or leap years or any of those kinds of things. So as far as I know, that's all handled pretty well by that underlying library. Things like events that actually cross over a time zone, I don't know that that's well supported, but that's a pretty edge case. So if you know of a system that actually does handle that well, by all means, let me know, because I'd be curious to know how they handle it. Next question, is there a way to indicate if an event has been canceled, rescheduled, or some other status change? So we kind of saw that a little bit in the calendar in terms of the ability to drag and drop. So you're actually rescheduling an event when you do that, but there's also an interface directly within the edit. So if we go down here for a recurring event, you have this manage instances, and here's where you can see all of your different instances. You could do things like say, let's cancel that particular one. And it'll display the overridden ones in italics with this font. That's not super obvious. It's putting the ones that you've canceled in strike through. So again, you can see when they were supposed to be. And if we wanted to, we could restore that one to default. So hopefully that answers that question in terms of the ability to manage those instances within recurring events. Next question. Do you have any recommendation on how to handle exhibit type events, long running with irregular repeat dates and times? So that one's a tough one, because I feel like if they're not recurring on some kind of a regular interval, you're almost better to just handle them as multi-value date fields. So you could go in here and say, let's go add an event. And because it's multi-value, you can just add additional items and keep adding them as you need them, because if there's no sort of regularity in terms of how they recur, then I don't know how you do any kind of a useful repeat value. So that's probably how I'd approach it, but definitely could talk after about that. Speaking of which, there is a BOF a little bit after this session, and I think it's about 15 minutes talking about dates and times in Drupal. So happy to continue discussion in there. Next question, why are time zones not named generically like Eastern, Western, Mountain, Central, etc.? I mean, that's a good question. I was just working with sort of what was in Drupal core. I can definitely see the argument for that. I know in terms of the date time spec, sometimes it will actually look for and sort of parse the place names or the actual sort of time zone code. So maybe it was done to make it more readable, but that's probably more generally a question for Drupal, because it wasn't, I would say, a design decision for this solution. John asks, the date format stuff could be useful outside of Smart Date, maybe a separate contrib module. So actually, the other thing that I haven't mentioned is that the Smart Date formatter and widget will work with core date fields. The big thing that you miss out on by not using them with the actual smart date field type is the ability to do sort of, repeating dates and so on. But if you just wanted the, let's say in your example, the output formatting, that is definitely something you could do using, a core date field and just using smart date for the formatter. Duncan asks, so it works with views unchanged. I think you said that. Okay, that sounds like he's answered his own question. Patrick asks, endless recurring dates sounds awesome. My experience is that this is a very tricky thing to pull off. Are there any gotchas regarding this particular feature? I will honestly answer honestly and say that there are no gotchas that I'm aware of, but I'm not sure to what extent that particular feature has been used extensively. So it would be awesome if you could use it, and then definitely file tickets for anything you find, and usually we try to get those resolved as quickly as possible. Shiraz asks, if you override a recurring date instance, say cancel a specific future recurring event, the R rule spec doesn't actually allow for this, correct? So it wouldn't allow show up in iCal import. So I believe that there is something in the R rule spec around exceptions. So it could be made to work. When you talk about it showing up in iCal, that's maybe a side question. And in terms of, are you using like views iCal or, some other method? And whether or not that's able to pass through is probably a combination of how well the way that you've configured your recurring rule, how complex you've made it, and also the method that you're using to try and sync that up with iCal. So I feel like I haven't really answered your question, but that's, again, kind of the honest answer there. Any thoughts on how to provide iCalendar or WebCal outputs? So there is an issue that's being actively worked on in the Views iCal module around having smart date support. So we've been sort of talking back and forth, the maintainers of that module and I, about trying to make sure that that we can have a good solid integration with those two. So I would say at this point, that's probably your best bet. But if there's something else that you think would be a better way to integrate those, then definitely open a feature request and would be happy to take a look at the level of difficulty there. Carson asks, what might be involved in migrating from the core date field to smart date? So that is an excellent question, because as of yesterday, there was a new stable release of the 3.2 branch of Smart Date, and one of the big features in that 3.2 branch is a Drush script that gives you the ability to do kind of a bulk migration of data from a core date field into a Smart Date field. So it's gone through some testing. There was definitely some iteration in the issue where we were developing that functionality, but if you want to try that out, and again, if you run into any issues, happy to support or bug fix as needed. Nicole asks, how would you handle recurring events that you only want to display once as a event only Mondays? Situation would be within a views list, for example, all Mondays displayed by default. So I think in the, if I understand what you're asking, let's go back here and we could say for recurring values, we could do something like, say, 0 recent instances and 0 upcoming. And then if we save that there. And let's close that out. And look at our recurring event. You should see it'll only have that sort of text to say, there. So if it was just every Monday at whatever time, you could definitely sort of configure it that way. So hopefully that answers your question. Luke asks, is there any sort of tag-based cache invalidation that happens on cron when events expire? So, so the honest answer is that right now, it will add new events on cron, but there isn't actually anything right now that's doing the expiry, because honestly, I was actually kind of hoping for some feedback from the community in terms of like, should we have the same kind of configuration to say how long they should be retained for before they expire, some of those kinds of things. So So far, you're like maybe the second person to ask about expiry of events. That's, again, if that was something where you had a lot of events and really needed that, it definitely could be added as a new feature. So if it's, you want to use the module and that's something that you need to open up a feature request. Emmons asks, can you associate an event with a specific taxonomy term so you can create a view allowing users to see all upcoming events that might be a fit with interest they have expressed? So yes, I mean, it's a standard content type, and like any kind of node, you can have taxonomy reference fields added in there, and then you could create a view, filtered on which term they are. You can also do things like in our events calendar, if I can just smart, I would make it easier to get there. You can even do things like configure this calendar so that it will color the events in different colors based on which taxonomy terms they've been tagged with. I think it's, don't quote me on this, but I think it only works with a single vocabulary, but hopefully that's robust enough to give you some options there in terms of giving an intuitive experience to your users. Eric asks, could you attach specific info to a recurring date, such as a theme? So off the top of my head, that's probably something you could do with context. It's maybe not at the theme level, but you could definitely do some customization by, let's say, having a different Twig template for that node, if that's something you needed to do. You could also use Layout Builder and just restructure the layout for that particular node. So there's a variety of different ways you could customize the output for a specific event. And hopefully, one of those options would line up with what you're trying to achieve. Let's see. Patrick asks, does the calendar come with the module, or is it part of the date calendar module? So it actually, the Smart Date Calendar Kit that we installed for this demo actually is its own, it loads a number of other contrib modules, one of them being this full calendar view that has like a completely separate maintainer. So yeah, I mean, you technically could use that without any of this. If you wanted to use some different kind of solution, maybe let's say a custom calendar that you wanted to implement, you definitely have that flexibility as well. Just at the time I was looking to integrate Smart Date with some kind of a calendar, it seemed like full calendar view was the one that was the best supported, and so far that integration has worked really well. Let's see here. Saraswati asks, can we show the calendar as a mini calendar? She shows full calendar. I'm sure it's possible. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure how to do that, but I'm not, to be honest, familiar off the top of my head of how you would easily implement a mini calendar within Drupal. So if you have a solution in mind that potentially could be integrated with Smart Date, again, open up a feature request and would definitely take a look at that. Savannah asks, how does the calendar scale for mobile? So let's actually take a look at that. I think it's not terrible, but in general, calendars on mobile are, not that awesome usually. So you can sort of see it crunches down. The ability for a finger to be able to navigate specifically to one of those events is probably not super great. That's why typically when I'm talking to clients, I say for sort of the public consumption of event data, usually more of a list view is going to be, more responsive, more accessible, all of those things. Actually, where I think the calendar presentation really shines is in the ability to provide sort of that drag and drop capability. Alexander asks, could you please share the link to your slides? So I am going to post it on the session. The organizers of DrupalCon have set up sort of a Dropbox system. So right after this session is done, I'm going to export it to a PDF, put it into the Dropbox, and they're going to put it into the session listing. So I probably will also tweet them. So actually, let's go back to here. So Manclue is my Twitter handle, so I'll probably be posting those on Twitter later on as well. Pete asks, can you control say what a site editor sees versus end user? Can you control if they see calendar or just lists? So the calendar being a view, you could definitely add, different permissions on there. If, for example, you wanted a user to not be able to see those, I will also mention that just because as an editor, I can drag and drop those events doesn't mean that a user without the proper permissions can do the same thing. So let me open up an anonymous window, drop that in there. And you can see as an anonymous user, I can click to the events, but it won't let me do any kind of, drag or anything. So it really is sort of access aware. Let's see. I'm going to keep going until that BOF starts, which is a couple of minutes now. Eric asks, this looks amazing. I'm wondering if you have been able to compare with the other available recurring event solutions. So actually, recurring events is a great module. There are obviously some very distinct differences between recurring events and Smart Date. Owen Bush, who's actually the maintainer of recurring events, is going to be in that BOF. So that could be a good discussion point, but particularly if you need to do things like registration for events, that's what I would say recurring events is actually really well built for that kind of a use case. Patrick asked, does Smart Dates play well with a module like Calendar Link to generate .ics files? So as of right now, I believe there's a patch to the Add to Cal module to make it work with Smart Date. Calendar Link specifically, I'm not sure of, but if that is something you needed, again, make a feature request and I would happily take a look at that. I have something a bit more custom than I would say the contrib modules I've seen in terms of how I want to have add to calendar links. But again, a lot of what's gotten Smart Date to where it is right now has really been the community stepping up and saying these are the things that we wanted to do. Like a perfect example is that ability to choose a subset of time zones. That was something that somebody asked in a session like this in the Q&A, and I was like, it doesn't do that, but there's no reason it couldn't, and it was not hard at all to implement. So so again, features like that, if you need them, by all means, open a feature request on the module page. Okay, I'm going to do one last one, and then we'll jump off. Mike O'Hara asks, what is the best way to filter on date occurrences by, say, month or year? Basically, filter on parts of dates and events. So there is an open issue against views around views datetime granularity. The patch on there, I've tested it and it works pretty well. I feel like it's actually maybe the test that needs to get updated so that it will pass. So right now, the way to do that is or the best way that I've found is to install that patch against core, and then you can basically set the date filter and then say, like match now, but with a granularity of year, and then that'll give you all dates this year kind of a thing. There are different ways you can do it. If you can set up a view that's like specific to a month, there are more custom ways that you could do it. But in my experience, that would be the easiest way, even though it does involve patching core. So I think I'm going to cap it there. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everybody's question, but as I say, we're going to be moving over to the Birds of a Feather session. So potentially we could pick up the conversation threads there. So thanks everybody for joining us.